Long before coins or banks existed, a vast financial web connected the ancient world. This network was built on promises, recorded not in gold, but in simple clay. We are uncovering the story of the clay tablet ledgers that reveal a complex Bronze Age credit system. By the end, you will see the very origins of modern finance etched into 4,000-year-old mud. How could a system of loans and interest thrive without any money, and what desperate measures emerged when this elegant system broke down? What does it tell you about the timeless human need to build trust across great distances? The quiet crackle of dry clay under a brush is a sound that has echoed through history. It is the sound of discovery, of a lost world whispering its secrets. Picture an archaeologist in the 1920s, kneeling in the sun-baked soil of what was once the merchant quarter of an Assyrian city. Their tool is not a shovel, but a soft brush, carefully sweeping away millennia of dust from a small, palm-sized rectangle of clay. It is unglamorous work of pharaohs' tombs. These tablets, often found in the administrative rooms of temples or in the storerooms of wealthy traders, looked like nothing more than ancient filing cabinets. They were ledgers, inventories, and receipts. To an untrained eye, they were lists of mundane things: so many measures of barley, so many bales of wool, so many ingots of copper. But to the scholar who could read the wedge-shaped cuneiform script pressed into their surface, these lists told a different story. They were not just records of what was, but contracts for what would be. The revolutionary leap was not in the recording of goods, but in the recording of time. A tablet might state, not that 10 sacks of grain were received, but that 10 sacks were given, with an obligation for 12 sacks to be returned after the next harvest. In that simple notation, a fundamental shift occurred. The physical commodity, the barley, became something new, a unit of abstract value, and the time between the giving and the returning, that span of seasons, became a commodity itself. This was the moment credit was born, not as a casual agreement between neighbors, but as a formal, recorded instrument. It meant a merchant in Assur could send tin to a trader in Anatolia, not for immediate payment, but for a promise sealed in clay, a promise that bound the future. This clay tablet was more than a receipt. It was a tiny time machine, allowing value to travel through the months and years, building the invisible architecture upon which all long-distance trade would depend. This tiny rectangle of clay was a legal world in miniature. To understand its power, we need to read its lines. A typical loan tablet, cool and solid in your hand, was a masterpiece of early bureaucracy. Its surface was divided into precise sections, each carrying a specific, crucial piece of information. First came the names, not written but often stamped with the personal seals of the two parties involved, the creditor and the debtor. These cylinder seals, rolled across the wet clay, left a unique, intricate pattern that served as an unforgeable signature, a mark of identity and honor. Then the core of the deal, the principal. The scribe would carefully note the type and exact quantity of the commodity loaned, whether it was 20 measures of barley, 5 ingots of refined tin, or 10 minas of raw wool. Next came the terms that turned a simple loan into an economic engine, the interest rate. Here, the numbers can seem startling to a modern eye. Rates of 20, 30, even 50% were not uncommon, calculated against the harvest cycle or the trading season. This was not seen as predatory in the same way we might view it today, but as a fair price for the risk and the opportunity the lender was providing. The repayment date was clearly stated, often tied to a specific future event like the next barley harvest or the arrival of a caravan. Finally, the tablet listed witnesses, their names and seals adding communal weight and legal enforceability to the agreement. Some of the most fascinating tablets were even sealed inside a clay envelope. The scribe would write the full contract on a smaller tablet, then encase it in a layer of fresh clay and inscribe a duplicate summary on the outside. If a dispute arose, the envelope could be broken open to reveal the original, intact text, a perfect 4,000-year-old tamper-proof system. This was not a casual IOU. This structured, repeatable format was a legally binding instrument, a prototype for every formal loan agreement, every bond, every financial contract that would follow. It reveals a society that had already wrestled with complex ideas of trust, risk, future value, and the rule of law, codifying them all into the humble, enduring surface of baked mud. But what was actually changing hands in this world of clay-bound promises? The answer reveals a monetary system far more sophisticated than simple barter. In the ledgers of Ashur and Babylon, three commodities appear again and again, forming the bedrock of the entire Bronze Age economy. First was barley, the fundamental staple of life. A measure of barley represented a day's ration, the very means of survival. Then came silver, not as coins, but weighed out in carefully standardized units, a dense store of value prized for its beauty and rarity. And finally, the metals that gave the age its name, copper and tin, the raw ingredients for bronze, the essential material for tools, weapons, and prestige goods. These were not just trade goods, they were something much more powerful. They were the era's reserve assets, the universally accepted benchmarks of value. Think of them not as sacks of grain or lumps of metal, but as the original forms of money. Their value was intrinsic and undeniable. Everyone understood the worth of food that could stave off hunger, or metal that could be forged into a plowshare or a ceremonial cup. This shared understanding created a stable foundation of trust. A merchant in Anatolia could accept a loan denominated in Assyrian barley because he knew with certainty that back in Ashur, or in any trading colony along the route, that barley could be exchanged for silver or for tin or for textiles. The ledgers show this fluidity in action. A debt might be contracted in 20 measures of barley, but the repayment clause could specify an equivalent value in shekels of silver using a fixed, agreed-upon exchange rate. This was a primitive but brilliantly effective multi-currency system, operating without a central bank or printed notes. It required and fostered a deep, shared commercial intelligence across the ancient Near East. A trader had to mentally juggle the fluctuating values of harvest yields against metal shipments, of regional scarcity against caravan delays. The stability of these commodity currencies, rooted in universal human needs, is what allowed credit to stretch over hundreds of miles and many months. The system was built on the tangible realities of hunger and utility, transformed by human agreement into an abstract network of deferred value. The real test of this financial invention was distance. A promise recorded in clay is only as strong as the trust it represents, and that trust now had to stretch across hundreds of miles of rugged mountains and open plains. The ledgers did not stay put in the archives of Ashur. They traveled, carried in the saddlebags of donkey caravans on a journey that could take months, moving from the heart of Mesopotamia all the way into the highlands of Anatolia, what is now modern Turkey. To manage this vast operation, Assyrian merchants established something remarkable, a network of permanent trading colonies called kharams. Think of a kharam not as a military outpost, but as a Bronze Age version of a foreign commercial district, a hub where expatriate merchants lived, worked, and enforced their own business laws far from home. The most famous of these was at the city of Canish, and the thousands of tablets found there paint a vivid portrait of a two-tiered economic world. At the top were the big players, the merchant houses back in Ashur. They extended massive lines of credit, often using goods like luxurious tin and finely woven textiles as their capital. These high-value commodities would be shipped by caravan to the colony on credit, with the understanding that the proceeds from their sale, usually in the form of silver or gold, would be shipped back after the trading season. This was long-term, wholesale finance. Meanwhile, within the colony itself, a bustling local economy thrived on smaller, more immediate credit. A merchant in Canish might borrow 10 shekels of silver from a colleague to pay caravan drivers, or take a loan of barley to feed his household, with the promise to repay from his next successful deal. This entire sprawling network was glued together by a mix of deep social bonds and cold, hard accounting. It operated on familial and ethnic ties. You trusted your cousin or your fellow Assyrian because your reputations were intertwined. But that personal trust was not enough. It was ultimately codified and made enforceable by the clay ledger. That tablet was the neutral authority. It spoke a universal language of quantities, dates, and seals that could be understood by any literate merchant, regardless of the local tongue or political allegiance. This is the true revelation. Here was a complex, long-distance trade system functioning for centuries without a central bank, a standing army to guard the routes, or a unified empire to impose laws. The system was the contract itself, baked into clay and honored across frontiers. It was a quiet, collective agreement that the future had value, and that a promise made could be a promise kept, even from a world away. Yet for all the bustling enterprise of the caravan traders, the true pillars of this financial world were not individuals, but towering institutions. Alongside the merchant houses, two entities wielded economic power on an entirely different scale: the temple and the royal palace. While a trader might finance a single caravan, these institutions financed entire civilizations. They were the original too big to fail entities, acting as both the system's largest creditors and its most ambitious debtors. Their clay tablets were not mere business records. They were the balance sheets of kingdoms. When a king wished to build a new irrigation canal to feed his cities, or erect a monumental ziggurat to honor the gods, he did not empty a royal treasury of coins. Instead, the palace issued promises. It would extend credit to overseers, promising payments in silver or barley to the armies of laborers and craftsmen, with the understanding that wealth from future harvests or tribute from conquered lands would settle the debt. The temple, however, was in a league of its own. As the literal house of the gods, it possessed an aura of divine creditworthiness that no mortal merchant could match. It controlled enormous tracts of the most fertile land, worked by temple dependents, generating a massive, predictable surplus of grain, wool, and other staples. This made the temple the ultimate stable asset. With this divine and economic backing, temples became the agricultural banks of the ancient world. At the start of each planting season, a temple would issue loans of seed grain and plow animals to local farmers. This was not pure charity. It was a sophisticated risk management tool. The loan ensured the land was cultivated, securing the temple's own future income from rents and shares of the harvest. For the farmer, it was a lifeline, a chance to survive a poor season and try again. If the harvest failed due to drought or flood, the temple, with its vast reserves, could absorb the loss better than any individual. It could even declare a clean slate, a periodic forgiveness of debts that prevented total social collapse. This institutional role provided a crucial layer of systemic stability. The temple and palace were not just participating in the economy, they were actively steering it, smoothing out the volatile cycles of agrarian life and mobilizing resources for projects that no private entity could ever undertake. In their ledgers, we see the earliest blueprints for public finance, for economic planning, and for a social safety net. They managed currency, set standards, issued credit, and acted as lenders of last resort. Their function was eerily familiar, performing the core duties of what we would now call a central bank or a national development agency, all inscribed on tablets of clay long before the concept of a nation-state even existed. That elegant system of promises and trust had a powerful, relentless engine. It was called hubulum, a word from ancient Akkadian that we translate simply as interest. In our modern world, interest is often an abstract percentage, a line on a bank statement. In the Bronze Age, it was a tangible, calculated measure of survival. The rates recorded in the clay tablets seem staggering by today's standards. For a loan of silver, you might see an annual charge of 20 or 30%. For a loan of barley, the life-sustaining grain, the rate could climb even higher. To our sensibilities, this looks like exploitation, but to view it that way is to misunderstand the world these merchants inhabited. These numbers were not arbitrary. They were a precise mathematical reflection of a profoundly risky reality. Every transaction was a gamble against a host of invisible forces. A caravan laden with tin could be lost to mountain bandits or a flash flood in a narrow pass. A shipment of barley, loaned at planting time, could be wiped out by a drought or a locust swarm before harvest. Political alliances between city-states could shift overnight, turning a safe trade route into hostile territory. The interest rate was the price of that uncertainty. It was an insurance premium, pooled from all successful ventures to cover the inevitable losses from those that failed. It also accounted for what economists now call opportunity cost. The silver or grain you lent to one trader was silver or grain you could not use yourself for an entire season. The interest compensated you for that lost opportunity, for tying up your capital in someone else's future. This sophisticated calculation of risk and time is what transformed capital from a static hoard, like treasure buried in a pot, into a dynamic, growing force. It created an incentive. Why would a wealthy merchant in Assur risk his valuable tin on a long, dangerous journey to Anatolia? Because the promise of hubulum, of that additional 20% return, made the gamble worthwhile. It was this engine that powered the movement of goods, ideas, and people across the known world, turning isolated city-states into nodes in a vibrant, interconnected network. The ancients understood, however, that an engine without a governor could tear itself apart. The most famous legal code of the era, that of King Hammurabi of Babylon, included specific regulations on interest. It acknowledged its necessity but also its potential for social harm. The code even provided for periodic clean slates, official decrees of debt relief, recognizing that if debt became too crushing for the farming class, the entire agricultural foundation of society could collapse. This reveals a profound early awareness that finance could not exist in a moral vacuum. The system needed trust to function, but unchecked, it could also destroy the very trust it was built upon. The clay tablets show us a civilization grappling with this duality, trying to balance the dynamism of credit with the stability of community, a challenge that echoes unmistakably into our own time. A promise etched in clay is only as strong as the fear of breaking it. So how did a merchant in Assur, separated by mountain ranges and months of travel, ensure a partner in Anatolia would honor his debt? There was no international police force, no global banking regulator to call upon. The enforcement of these contracts rested on a sophisticated, three-part foundation that made trust a tangible and breakable commodity. The first and most powerful force was social capital, a merchant's most valuable asset. The trading world of the Karams was a close-knit community, bound by kinship, ethnicity, and shared commercial language. Your reputation was your credit score. If you defaulted on a loan, word traveled fast along the caravan routes. You would be blacklisted, cut off from future credit, partnerships, and the protection of the merchant network. In an economy built entirely on connection, this was an economic death sentence, a fate far worse than any fine. To forge that trust at the outset, the system relied on undeniable proof, the personal cylinder seal. Pressed into the wet clay of the tablet, this unique imprint was more than a signature. It was your commercial identity, your bond. disputing a contract bearing your own seal was virtually impossible. It was the ancient equivalent of a notarized biometric signature, creating an immutable record that all parties and witnesses could agree upon. Beyond the merchant community, a broader framework of law provided a backdrop. Treaties between city-states and kingdoms often included specific clauses guaranteeing the safety of merchants and the legal enforcement of their contracts. A ruler had a vested interest in protecting this lucrative trade, so his courts could be called upon to adjudicate disputes between foreign merchants operating in his territory. This gave the clay tablet a kind of diplomatic passport recognized across borders, yet for all this structure, the system had a brutal, final layer for when everything else failed. For individuals without the cushion of wealth or powerful connections, default could lead to a form of bonded service where a debtor or their family members worked to repay the obligation. This was a stark reminder of the high stakes involved, a last resort mechanism that underlined the seriousness of these financial promises. It was this potent blend, the social death of a ruined reputation, the legal weight of a sealed contract, and the severe personal consequences of failure that transformed credit from a hopeful gamble into a calculable risk. It made the abstract notion of a future repayment feel concrete and enforceable, even from 1,000 miles away. The system worked because the cost of betrayal was meticulously engineered to be higher than the cost of honor. The entire system rested on the shoulders of a single, indispensable profession. In the quiet scriptorium of a temple or the busy office of a merchant house, the scribe dipped his stylus into wet clay, not ink. He was the system's architect, its operator, and its memory. Mastering cuneiform was no simple task. It was a rigorous, elite education that could take years. A student scribe had to learn hundreds of complex wedge-shaped signs, each representing a syllable or a whole word, across two distinct languages: Sumerian, the ancient classical tongue of scholarship, and Akkadian, the living language of business and law. This was not merely learning to write, it was becoming fluent in the very code of civilization. But his role went far beyond transcription. The scribe was the world's first true accountant and data manager. When a loan contract was finalized and the seals were pressed, his work was just beginning. He would carefully categorize the tablet by transaction type, by the parties involved, and by its due date. He would then file it in a specific room on a specific shelf within a vast, organized archive. These archives were the hard drives of the Bronze Age. To manage the sheer volume, scribes developed brilliant bureaucratic innovations. They created standardized form tablets for common transactions, ensuring consistency. They compiled summary ledgers, distilling the details of dozens of individual contracts into a single overview of assets and liabilities. For particularly complex or disputed deals, they might even assemble a case file, a collection of all related correspondence and witness statements tied to a single transaction. This required a rare fusion of skills: mathematical precision to calculate interest and commodity exchanges, legal understanding to phrase binding clauses, and linguistic artistry to render it all in clear, unambiguous script. Their ultimate creation was institutional memory. Because of their work, a merchant house could look back and see not just what was owed today, but what had been loaned 5 years ago to whom and whether it was repaid. A temple could track the seed grain it had distributed across an entire region over a generation. They transformed fleeting verbal agreements into a permanent, searchable record that could be audited, referenced, and enforced long after the original participants had passed on. This professional class, these keepers of the clay, were the human infrastructure that turned a clever idea into a sustainable system. Without their meticulous, standardized work, the web of credit would have remained a tangled mess of personal promises, unable to scale or endure. They built the first administrative framework for capitalism, one carefully impressed tablet at a time. But even the most brilliantly designed system faces forces it cannot control. The ledgers of barley and silver, so carefully balanced in times of plenty, told a darker story when the rains failed or the armies marched. A single poor harvest could cascade through the entire network. A farmer who borrowed seed grain could not repay it. The merchant who relied on that repayment then defaulted on his own loan for tin. The caravan organizer, unpaid, could not finance his next journey. What began as a local hardship could ripple outward, freezing the flow of credit and goods, threatening the social order itself. The clay tablets from these periods reveal a desperate pattern, loans being rescheduled again and again, interest piling upon interest, leading to a grim outcome recorded with chilling simplicity. Individuals and entire families, unable to meet their obligations, could enter a state of bonded service to their creditors. This was the system's breaking point, where abstract financial failure translated into profound personal loss. It was in response to these recurring crises that Mesopotamian rulers performed one of history's most radical economic interventions. They issued royal decrees known as Mesharim Acts, often translated as justice decrees or acts of equity. Imagine the scene: a herald standing in the temple courtyard, reading aloud a proclamation from the king. His words would declare a clean slate. Specific types of debt, particularly those held by small farmers for things like seed grain or subsistence silver, were simply annulled. Those who had entered bonded service due to debt were to be released and returned to their families and their land. These were not acts of charity in the modern sense. They were calculated, sophisticated resets for the entire civilization. A king understood that a countryside populated by destitute, indebted farmers was a countryside that could not produce food, pay taxes, or supply soldiers. It was a recipe for famine, rebellion, and collapse. The Mesharim Act was a preventative measure, a way to restore the economic foundation before it crumbled completely. Think of it as a periodic rebooting of the system. By wiping certain debts away, the king was not destroying wealth, but rather releasing trapped productive potential. He was freeing human capital, the farmer, the artisan, the laborer, from a financial prison so they could once again contribute to the economy. This was a profound recognition, etched into law thousands of years ago, that an economy is not just a ledger of assets and liabilities, but a living web of human activity. If the web became too burdened, it would snap. The decree cut the weights away. These acts were often tied to the beginning of a new reign, a symbolic fresh start, but they were also deployed in direct response to crises like war or natural disaster. They represent perhaps the earliest concept of macroeconomic policy and social welfare, an institutional acknowledgement that the market, left entirely to its own devices, could consume itself. It introduced a cyclical idea of correction, a built-in pressure valve for the very system the clay tablets had created. The ledgers, therefore, tell two parallel stories, one of incredible innovation and trust building across vast distances, and another of the inherent fragility of that same construction. They show us a society not just inventing finance, but already wrestling with its most enduring and difficult question: how to harness its power for growth without allowing it to unravel the very fabric of community. The story of Bronze Age finance, however, does not end at the banks of the Euphrates. While the clay tablet ledgers of Mesopotamia offer our clearest window, they were not a solitary light in the ancient world. Far to the west, across the Mediterranean, the Minoan palaces of Crete and the later Mycenaean citadels of mainland Greece developed their own intricate systems of economic control. They too used clay tablets, inscribed with a script scholars call Linear B, which was used primarily for palace accounting. These records, deciphered in the 1950s, do not show the private merchant contracts of Assur. Instead, they reveal a highly centralized redistribution economy. The palace acted as the absolute hub, collecting raw materials like wool, grain, and olive oil from the surrounding countryside. then issuing those materials to specialized workshops for the production of textiles, perfumed oil, and bronze goods. This entire operation, from collection to distribution, required an advanced understanding of deferred value. When the palace allocated wool to a weaver, it was an advance, a form of credit against the future delivery of finished cloth. The meticulous inventories tracking every spindle and every jar imply a web of obligations and future promises binding the producers to the central authority. It was a different model, more command-driven than the freewheeling Assyrian merchant networks, but it was built on the same fundamental principle: recording and managing what was owed for what had been given. Even more tantalizing is the mystery of the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwest India around the same time. Their script, found on thousands of small seals and tablets, remains one of history's great undeciphered puzzles. We cannot read a single word of their economic records. Yet the physical artifacts speak volumes. Archaeologists have uncovered exquisitely standardized stone weights, cubes, and spheres that maintain a consistent ratio across cities separated by hundreds of miles. They have found thousands of unique seals carved with animals and symbols, likely used to mark bales of goods or clay tags, much like the cylinder seals of Mesopotamia. This points to a vast, regulated trade network operating on shared standards and, almost certainly, a system of trust that extended beyond simple barter. The movement of goods like carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, and cotton over such long distances would have been incredibly difficult without some mechanism for deferred payment or consignment. While we lack the written proof, the infrastructure of trust, the seals and the weights strongly suggest that the people of the Indus Valley were also navigating the world of credit, creating promises that their trading partners, perhaps in Mesopotamia itself, could understand and accept. This broader view reveals something profound. The Mesopotamian model is not a unique invention, but rather the most detailed example we have of a recurring pattern. When a civilization reaches a certain threshold of scale and complexity, when its trade stretches beyond the horizon and its harvests feed thousands, the management of future promises becomes not just useful but essential. It is an evolutionary step in social organization. Whether it was an Assyrian merchant financing a tin caravan, a Mycenaean palace allocating wool to weavers, or an Indus Valley trader sealing a shipment of cotton, they were all solving the same core problem: how to coordinate the labor and resources of countless people across space and time. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are so invaluable because they give us the script, the dialogue of this ancient economic play. They show us the precise mechanics, the interest rates, the collateral, the legal clauses that other civilizations likely developed in their own forms. They offer us a master template, a detailed blueprint of how humanity first learned to build bridges of trust not just between individuals, but across entire civilizations, laying the invisible groundwork for the connected world we inhabit today. Yet for all its meticulous detail, the world of the clay tablet was a silent one to the vast majority of people. Literacy, the ability to read and write the complex cuneiform script, was a skill reserved for a tiny, powerful elite: the scribes, the merchants, the priests, and the royals. For the farmer in his field, the potter at his wheel, or the shepherd on the hillside, a financial agreement was not pressed into clay. It was sealed with a handshake, a spoken oath before neighbors, or a simple symbolic gesture like breaking a piece of straw in two. This creates a profound duality in the Bronze Age economy, a split-level world of trust. On one level, there was a vast, humming underworld of informal credit, woven through every village and marketplace. You might borrow a goat from your cousin with a promise to return its first kid, or receive a sack of seed from a neighbor in exchange for help at harvest time. This system ran entirely on community memory and social pressure. Your reputation was your collateral, and the disapproval of your peers was a powerful enforcement mechanism. It was immediate, personal, and required no documentation. Parallel to this, operating in a different realm entirely, was the formal system of the written ledger. The clay tablet did not emerge to record the loan of a single goat. It was created for transactions where the informal system broke down, where distance, scale, or time stretched personal trust beyond its limits. When a shipment of tin worth a fortune needed to travel for months across foreign lands, memory was not enough. When a temple issued seed grain to hundreds of farmers across a province, personal bonds were insufficient. The written contract handled the heavy lifting of the economy, the high-stakes, long-term deals that formed the backbone of long-distance trade and state finance. This layered approach is a hallmark of a complex society. The written record did not replace the spoken promise. It complemented it, each operating in its own sphere. One was the deep, resilient root system of local life, built on face-to-face relationships. The other was the sturdy trunk and branches that allowed value to reach out across continents. They were two different tools for building trust, each essential, each reflecting a different kind of human connection. This duality asks us a subtle but important question about the nature of progress. Did the invention of formal credit, for all its brilliance in enabling grand commerce, also begin to create a distance between an agreement and the people behind it? When a debt is a name on a tablet in an archive, rather than a face in your village, does something fundamental in the human transaction change? The ledgers show us a society navigating this very transition, learning to live in both worlds at once, using the spoken word to sustain the community and the written word to build an empire. A clay tablet's greatest vulnerability was also its ultimate salvation. These ledgers, filled with careful calculations and future promises, were meant to be temporary. Once a debt was settled, the tablet would be dampened, the clay softened, and the surface smoothed to be reused for the next transaction. They were the scrap paper of the ancient world, not monuments built for eternity. Their survival for 4,000 years is a profound historical irony, a gift handed down to us through disaster. The thriving merchant colony at Canish met a violent end, its administrative buildings consumed by a tremendous fire, likely during a period of regional conflict. For the Assyrian traders living and working there, it was a catastrophe, the sudden collapse of their world. Yet that very fire performed an accidental miracle. The intense heat did not destroy the tablets. It fired them like pottery in a kiln, transforming the soft, recyclable clay into a hard, ceramic-like material. What was meant to be ephemeral became virtually indestructible, sealed in a moment of chaos. This pattern repeats across the ancient Near East. In the great cities of Uruk and Nippur, entire archive rooms were preserved not by fire but by collapse. When a palace or temple was sacked or abandoned, its mud brick walls crumbled, burying the shelves of tablets under tons of debris. Protected from the elements and from later human disturbance, they lay in wait for millennia. While these events represented profound loss for the societies that experienced them, for archaeologists they are unparalleled windfalls. Unlike documents written on perishable materials like papyrus, parchment, or wood, which rot away in all but the driest climates, these baked clay records defy time. They become perfect time capsules, capturing a single administrative moment frozen in the instant the building fell. This gives us a view of history that is startlingly immediate and deeply human. We are not reading the sanitized, boastful accounts carved into stone monuments by kings to glorify their reigns. We are peering over the shoulder of a tired scribe at the end of a long day. We see the messy, gritty reality of economic life, the loan given to a farmer after a poor harvest, the frantic letter from a caravan agent complaining about bandits on the route, the careful notation of a debt repaid in worn-out copper ingots of slightly suspect weight. We witness ambition, anxiety, and shrewd calculation. A tablet might record a merchant's desperate plea for more silver to cover a bad deal, or a woman's contract to run a tavern using capital advanced by the temple. This is the raw data of Bronze Age globalization, preserved not in a library curated by later generations, but in the buried filing cabinets of the people who lived it. The fire that destroyed Canish did not erase its history. It baked its story into permanence, gifting us with the unvarnished truth of how a world of credit, risk, and human connection truly operated. The quiet authority of a personal cylinder seal pressed into wet clay knew no gender. Among the thousands of administrative tablets, a significant number bear the distinctive seals of women, names like Beltoni, Amat Shamash, or Iltoni clearly inscribed as the creditor in a loan contract. This simple fact shatters the long-held image of the ancient economy as an exclusively male arena of trade and negotiation. These women, often from elite families or with deep ties to temple institutions, were not passive holders of wealth. They were active, calculating participants in the credit system. They loaned out their own silver, their own stores of barley, and their own measured amounts of wool, expecting a return with interest. A tablet might record that the Lady Beltoni loaned 10 shekels of silver to a local merchant, with the repayment due after the caravan season, her seal serving as the legal guarantee. This was not a trivial or occasional activity. For some, it was a primary means of managing and growing their personal assets. The most prominent example comes from the very top of society. Enheduanna, the daughter of the Akkadian king Sargon and the high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the city of Ur, was one of the most powerful women of her age. While famed as the world's first author known by name, her religious role also came with immense economic authority. She would have overseen vast temple estates and their associated commercial enterprises, effectively acting as the chief executive of a major financial institution. Further north, in the Assyrian trading colonies, the letters reveal merchant wives who managed the family business back in Ashur while their husbands were away for years on caravan routes. These women bought and sold goods, settled accounts, and extended credit to other traders, all through the formal medium of sealed tablets. Their participation tells us something profound about the nature of this early system. It was at its core a system of property. If a woman could own valuable commodities, whether through inheritance, dowry, or her own enterprise, then she could deploy them as capital. The legal framework of the contract, symbolized by her seal, protected that right and allowed her to engage with the broader economy. This indicates that while ancient Mesopotamian societies were patriarchal, a woman's legal and economic agency could be substantial within certain protected contexts, especially if her wealth was tied to the sacred authority of a temple or the commercial needs of a long-distance trade network. These ledgers are their silent testimony. They correct the historical record, revealing that the capital formation that built early urban life, the very lifeblood of the credit system, flowed through the hands of forgotten creditors whose stories were written not in epic poetry, but in the meticulous lines of a financial ledger. That final cognitive leap is perhaps their most enduring gift to us. The true revolution of the clay ledger was not in its function as a record, but in its nature as a symbol. With each impression of the stylus, these merchants and scribes performed a quiet act of philosophical alchemy. They separated the idea of value from the physical thing itself. The tablet in your hand was just baked mud of no inherent worth, yet it confidently stated a claim to 20 measures of barley still growing in a distant field, or to 5 ingots of tin still smoldering in a furnace a 6-month journey away. The value had leapt from the tangible object and taken up residence in the abstract promise, in the trust that the future would unfold as predicted. This was a monumental shift in human thought. For millennia, value was direct and immediate, a sharp flint, a warm hide, a ripe piece of fruit. You could hold it, use it, consume it. The ledger introduced something entirely new, value you could not touch, only believe in. It was value stored in time, secured by nothing but a communal agreement that the marks on this clay had meaning and would be honored. This is the foundational concept upon which every advanced economy is built. Consider a modern parallel. A crisp paper banknote is in itself just a piece of linen and ink. You cannot eat it or build a shelter with it. Its worth derives entirely from our collective trust that everyone else will accept it in exchange for real goods and services. A stock certificate is a digital entry representing a tiny sliver of ownership in a vast, distant enterprise you may never visit. A Bitcoin is a string of code, a mathematical idea that has been granted immense value by global consensus. Each of these is a direct descendant of the clay tablet. They are all tokens, physical or digital, that stand in for something else, for productivity, for assets, for future potential. The Bronze Age merchants, through sheer pragmatic necessity, stumbled into a profound philosophical truth. They began the essential human journey from concrete barter to abstract symbol, from weighing a lump of silver to trusting a sealed promise. This cognitive leap allowed civilization to scale in ways previously impossible. It meant wealth could be moved without moving mountains of grain. It meant capital could be allocated to projects that would not bear fruit for years. It meant an economy could become a network of interconnected futures, a tapestry of mutual obligations stretching across space and time. They invented the concept of financial representation, and in doing so, they built the mental architecture for the modern world. Their ledgers were the first vessels carrying the most volatile and powerful substance human society has ever created. Not gold, not silver, but trust itself, crystallized into a permanent, transferable form. The brilliance of a system built on trust casts a long and often unforgiving shadow. While the ledgers enabled grand commerce and monumental projects, they also recorded a far more personal and desperate reality for countless individuals. The very mechanisms that fueled growth, the calculated interest, the binding contracts could, under the weight of misfortune, become instruments of profound hardship. A single season of drought, a failed caravan, or an unexpected illness could shatter the delicate balance of a household's finances. When a farmer could not repay the seed grain loaned from the temple, or an artisan defaulted on silver advanced for tools, the contract's terms moved from the abstract into a painfully concrete realm. The ultimate collateral, in many cases, was not more barley or silver, but human labor itself. To settle an unpayable debt, an individual or members of their family could enter a state of service to the creditor. This was not chattel slavery as later understood, but a bonded status where work was applied directly against the debt's balance. It was a legal, institutionalized outcome, meticulously noted in the tablets alongside entries for wool and grain. The ledgers thus reveal the system's grim equilibrium. For credit to flow freely, lenders required absolute security, and in a world where material possessions were limited, a person's capacity for work became a form of currency. This practice did more than resolve individual defaults. It actively sculpted the social landscape. It created a visible, entrenched underclass, families locked in a cycle where debt beget more debt, and freedom became a receding horizon. The potential for this downward spiral was so well understood that it became a central concern of governance. The royal Mesharam decrees, those periodic clean slates, were direct political responses to this accumulating social pressure. They were emergency releases for a system threatening to seize. A king would proclaim such an act not purely from benevolence, but from a stark recognition that a society stratified beyond repair was a fragile one, unable to muster soldiers or feed its cities. The clay tablets, in their dispassionate script, hold both sides of this ancient truth. They are monuments to human ingenuity in organizing complex endeavors, and they are also archives of vulnerability, showing how the tools of prosperity could, when fate turned, deepen divides and cost individuals their autonomy. This duality is not a relic of the past, but a perennial feature of financial innovation. It poses a question that echoes from the Bronze Age to our own time. How do we harness the incredible power of credit to build and connect, while designing safeguards to prevent it from consuming the very people it is meant to serve? The ledgers offer no easy answer, but they insist we remember the human stakes written between the lines of every economic equation. A single clay tablet is a conversation between countless disciplines. To understand its full story, we need more than a translation of its text. We need to listen to the very substance it is made from, and to the hidden meanings woven into its words. Linguists specializing in ancient Akkadian do not simply read the contracts. They analyze the language itself as a living artifact. They trace how the precise term for interest, hubulum, evolved over centuries, its meaning shifting subtly as financial practices became more sophisticated. They study the vocabulary of trust and obligation, watching how legal phrases were standardized and spread across the Near East alongside trade goods. This is more than word history. It reveals how an entire culture conceptualized abstract economic relationships. The language fossilized within the ledger shows us the moment a society needed, and therefore invented, a new word for a complex idea like collateral or default. Meanwhile, a scientist in a laboratory takes a tiny, almost invisible sample from the edge of a tablet. Using techniques like X-ray fluorescence, they bombard the clay with energy, causing it to reveal its elemental fingerprint. Every river basin, every source of clay, has a unique chemical signature, a specific blend of minerals picked up from the local geology. By matching the tablet's fingerprint to known clay sources, archaeometrists can perform a kind of forensic origin check. They can determine if a tablet found in Anatolia was written on local clay or on clay imported from a specific riverbank near a shore. This transforms a piece of administrative waste into a map. It traces the invisible trade in the very material of bureaucracy, showing that sometimes the medium was as mobile as the message. It proves that merchants carried blank clay tablets with them on their journeys, or that specific centers produced standardized tablets for commercial use, creating a literal common ground for contracts. Even the blank, uninscribed back of a tablet holds a silent record. When the scribe prepared his surface, he often set the wet lump of clay on a woven reed mat to keep it from sticking to the table. The impression of that mat, its unique weave pattern pressed permanently into the clay, is a snapshot of everyday technology. Textile specialists can study these impressions to understand weaving techniques, the common materials, and even regional styles of mat making. It is an intimate, accidental detail that connects the high finance of the merchant to the domestic craft of the artisan. When you combine these threads, the linguistic, the chemical, the tactile, each ledger ceases to be just a financial document. It becomes a hyper-dense data point for the ancient world. A passing mention of a poor barley harvest in a loan deferral becomes a climate datum, hinting at a drought year. A sudden shift in the flow of silver from one city to another can signal a political realignment or a conflict that disrupted trade routes. The repeated appearance of the same family seals across dozens of tablets over generations allows historians to reconstruct social networks and dynasties of wealth, tracing how commercial power was inherited and maintained. This multidisciplinary mosaic shows us that the Bronze Age system was not a sterile machine of economics. It was an ecology. It was deeply responsive to the environment, to technological innovation, to the nuances of language, and to the intricate web of human relationships. The ledger was the node where all these forces converged and were recorded. To read it with only one set of eyes is to see just the shadow of the story. To read it with the combined vision of historian, linguist, and scientist is to see the full, vibrant world that pressed itself into the clay. The organization of these archives reveals a mind attuned to the future. A recovered storage room was not a chaotic jumble of tablets, but a carefully ordered library of obligations. Scribes did not simply stack their records and walk away. They developed sophisticated, physical systems for data storage and retrieval that feel remarkably familiar. Tablets from the same merchant family, or concerning the same caravan expedition, were often tied together with cord and stored in labeled baskets made of reed or leather. In larger archives, they were arranged on shelves, grouped by transaction type, commodity, or year. Some batches even included a tag, a smaller, summary tablet placed at the front that listed the key details of the contracts within, like a primitive folder label. This was not merely neatness, it was the birth of the administrative database. Scribes went further, creating master catalogs and indexes on separate tablets. These were the search functions of the ancient world. A clerk could consult an index to locate, for instance, all outstanding loans issued by the merchant Ashur-Nadar in the 3rd year of the king's reign, or every transaction involving Anatolian copper. The ability to instantly retrieve a contract from 5 or even 10 years prior was not a luxury. It was a commercial necessity. It was how a merchant house proved its claims in a dispute, how a temple audited its vast holdings, or how partners settled accounts on a multi-year trading venture that involved countless advances and repayments. This impulse to create structured, accessible memory outside the human brain is one of humanity's most profound technological leaps. It allowed an institution to operate beyond the lifespan or personal recall of any single individual. The archive became the institution's permanent memory, its institutional consciousness. In that quiet, dusty storeroom, we see the direct ancestor of every filing cabinet, every library catalog, every server farm that holds the digital pulse of our modern world. They understood that information was only powerful if you could find it again. By building these first relational systems in clay and reed, they were encoding a principle that would outlast empires. That civilization itself depends on our ability to organize what we know and to pass that organized knowledge forward in time. The intricate network of trust did not exist in a vacuum of endless prosperity. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the entire interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age shuddered and fell apart. A cascade of events, from migrations and internal rebellions to climate shifts and the mysterious sea peoples, brought a swift and dramatic end to the Hittite Empire, severely weakened the Egyptian New Kingdom, and saw the great palaces of the Mycenaeans burn. The grand international trade routes that had carried tin, copper, and luxury goods for centuries snapped. Literacy, that specialized skill of the scribble elite, retreated or vanished in many regions. It was a true dark age, a severing of connections that had taken centuries to build. In the silence that followed, a pressing question hangs in the air. Did the financial system, so dependent on that connectivity, perish in the flames as well? The answer, discovered in the layers of clay left behind, is a testament to resilience. While the specific, glorious network of Assyrian merchant colonies was erased from the map, the core concept they perfected did not die. In the heartland of Mesopotamia, the practice of recording loans and contracts on clay tablets stubbornly persisted. As new Iron Age kingdoms like the Neo-Assyrian and later the Neo-Babylonian empires rose from the ashes, they inherited the administrative tools of their predecessors. The ledgers from these later periods show the same familiar formats: loans of silver and grain, calculated interest, and personal seals. The great law codes, like that of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, which had codified rules on debt and interest, were copied and studied by new generations of scribes. They became part of the cultural and legal bedrock, a permanent addition to the toolkit of civilization. This survival is crucial. It tells us the system was not merely a clever trick of one particular trading culture, but a solution to a problem so fundamental that every complex society that followed would eventually need it. The problem was, and always will be, how to create trust across time and space. When the empires rebuilt, they still needed to finance harvests, build infrastructure, and pay soldiers. They still needed a way to make promises beyond the horizon of personal acquaintance. The clay tablet and the logic it contained provided that blueprint. This resilient kernel of an idea would be carried forward, absorbed and adapted by the vast Persian Empire that later unified the Near East. From there, it would pass into the Hellenistic world after the conquests of Alexander the Great, where Greek bankers would operate with familiar principles, albeit on papyrus rather than clay. The concepts would later flow into the expanding Islamic world, where sophisticated financial instruments and partnerships would flourish, all built upon that ancient foundation of recorded credit. The physical medium would eventually evolve from clay to parchment to digital bits, but the underlying architecture, the binding promise, the calculation of time and risk, the formalization of trust remained recognizably the same. The collapse at the end of the Bronze Age was not a full stop, but a brutal semicolon. It proved that while palaces can crumble and trade routes can grow silent, a truly powerful idea, one that answers a deep and enduring human need, is far harder to erase. It simply waits in the ashes, ready to be picked up and written anew by the hands of a recovering world. The principles baked into those clay tablets never really left us. They simply changed form, evolving from the dusty caravan routes of Anatolia into the fiber optic cables of our digital age. Consider the Assyrian merchant network, a web of trusted agents spanning thousands of miles without a central authority. A trader in Assur could deposit silver with a colleague, who would send a coded clay message to an agent in Canish, instructing him to pay out an equivalent sum to a local business partner. This bypassed the physical movement of heavy metal across dangerous terrain. It is, in essence, the exact blueprint of the ancient Hawala system still used in parts of the world today, and a startling precursor to modern digital value transfer. The system did not rely on a single bank or government ledger, but on the integrity of a closed network of trusted individuals keeping their own accounts. Sound familiar? This is the foundational logic of blockchain and distributed ledger technology. The trust is not placed in a central institution, but in a transparent, shared, and immutable record maintained by the network itself. Look even closer at their tamper-proofing. Remember the clay envelope, the contract sealed inside a layer of clay with a summary written outside. To verify the original terms, you had to break the outer shell. This is a physical 4,000-year-old analog to cryptographic sealing. The outer inscription was the hash, a unique representation of the data within. Any alteration to the inner tablet would make the outer summary invalid, immediately revealing the tampering. Their solution for verifying authenticity across distance was different in mechanism, but identical in purpose to our digital signatures and encrypted ledgers. Both systems solve the same core problem. How do you prove something is original and unchanged when you cannot personally witness its journey? Our modern lives are governed by echoes of their other innovations. That merchant's reputation, carefully cultivated within the Karam network, was his lifeline. A single default could exile him from all future trade. Today, we have formalized that exact social calculus into the credit score, a numerical representation of your financial reputation that determines your access to loans, housing, and opportunity. The community judgment of the trading colony is now an algorithm, but the principle remains unchanged. Trust must be quantified to enable risk. Even the most dramatic interventions have their parallels. The Mesharam decrees, where a king would declare a clean slate for certain debts, were acts of sovereign financial reset. They were necessary to prevent a cascade of defaults from destroying the agricultural base of society. In our era, we see a similar logic play out on a global scale with sovereign debt restructuring. When a nation's obligations become impossible to manage, the international community often negotiates a partial forgiveness or rescheduling of debt. The goal is the same: to release unsustainable pressure and allow the economic system, whether a kingdom or a country, to continue functioning. This is the profound lesson hidden in the ledger lines. The technologies we celebrate as revolutionary digital trust systems, algorithmic risk assessment, complex international finance, are not fundamentally new. They are elegant, high-speed answers to the ancient, enduring human puzzles first confronted by those Bronze Age merchants. How do you create trust with a stranger you will never meet? How do you price the risk of a future that is inherently unknown? How do you build a system that empowers growth without guaranteeing its own collapse? The clay tablets show us that we have been wrestling with these questions for millennia. Our silicon chips and global markets are just the latest tools in that long, continuous conversation. By studying their world, we gain a clarifying perspective on our own. We see that finance, at its heart, is not really about money or technology. It is about the eternal human endeavor to build bridges of promise across the uncertain landscape of time. But the ledgers only tell us what happened. To understand who these people were, we must read their mail. Alongside the neat columns of accounts, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of personal letters exchanged between merchants, their families, and their agents. These are not formal contracts, but raw, unfiltered conversations pressed into clay, and they breathe life into the numbers. Suddenly, the system has a voice, and it is full of worry, ambition, and very human irritation. In one famous series of letters, we meet a merchant named Puser Asher, writing from the trading colony at Canish back to his family in Assur. His tone shifts from confident instruction to palpable anxiety as he awaits the return of a caravan carrying his entire fortune in tin and textiles. He writes of delays, of rumors of bandits on the mountain passes, of the agonizing silence when expected messages do not arrive. You can almost hear his sigh of relief in the clay when he finally reports a successful sale, detailing the precise weight of silver he is sending home. His letters are a real-time diary of risk, a 4,000-year-old lesson in the stomach-churning volatility of long-distance trade. Then there is Imdi Ilm, a senior merchant utterly exasperated with his junior partner. In a sharply worded dispatch, he complains that the man is lazy, that he sleeps too late and neglects the accounts, and that his poor management is costing them both profit. Imdi Ilm demands immediate improvement, threatening to cut the partner's share if things do not change. This is not a royal decree or a legal statute. It is the timeless frustration of a senior colleague dealing with an unreliable underling, a scene that could play out in any modern office or startup. Perhaps most revealing are the letters from the women left behind. While their husbands and sons were on the road for years at a time, wives like Lamassi took full control of the family enterprise. Her correspondence shows a sharp business mind. She instructs her husband on which commodities are selling well, negotiates with other merchants for better prices on wool, and authorizes loans from their own capital. She is not a passive keeper of the home. She is the chief financial officer of a thriving concern, making strategic decisions that would determine the family's wealth for a generation. These letters dismantle the abstraction completely. They reveal the emotional engine of the entire credit system, not cold calculation, but a turbulent mix of hope and fear. The joy of a windfall profit, the crushing disappointment of a lost shipment, the gossip exchanged about who is trustworthy and who is not in the crowded karam, all of it is there. These individuals were not just moving commodities. They were navigating a web of personal relationships, professional rivalries, and familial duty. Their success depended as much on their skill in judging character as it did on their ability to calculate interest. They forged alliances, nursed grudges, and bet their futures on the integrity of people they might only see once every few years. In their pleas, their boasts, and their everyday instructions, we recognize ourselves. They were entrepreneurs, managers, and investors, grappling with the same core challenges of trust, communication, and uncertainty that define business today. The clay preserved their transactions, but these letters preserved their humanity, making the gap of millennia feel suddenly, intimately small. That same silver, weighed out as loan capital, first had to be torn from the earth. The ledgers of barley and metal were not just abstract accounts, they were direct transcripts of the natural world, a financial system built upon the rhythms of harvests and the scars of mines. Every transaction was a link in a chain that stretched back to a riverbank, a field, or a mountainside. A loan denominated in barley was in essence a bet on the sun and the rain, a financial instrument tied to the success of a single crop cycle. When the rains failed, the entire delicate structure of agricultural credit could shudder. The tablets from such years show a frantic pattern of deferrals and desperate pleas, as the ecological reality of drought overrode the neat calculations of interest on clay. The system did not exist outside of nature. It was a nervous response to it, an attempt to manage the terrifying uncertainty of subsistence in an arid land. Beyond the fields, the demand for the metals that served as reserve currencies, silver and copper, carried a heavier environmental cost. To have ingots to weigh and loan, you needed mines. Ancient mining was a brutal extraction process, consuming vast quantities of timber for smelting and leaving behind landscapes altered by trenches and slag heaps. The very existence of a silver standard economy in Mesopotamia, a region poor in silver deposits, meant this environmental impact was outsourced. The damage was done in distant hills of Anatolia or Iran, but the financial benefit flowed to the city-states. This was an early form of ecological displacement, where the environmental footprint of wealth was separated from its point of use. The system's hunger for standardized value directly fueled an industry of excavation and combustion. Even the most mundane element of the system, the clay tablet itself, had an environmental ledger. Not just any mud would do. Scribes sought specific, fine-grained clay from particular river deposits that would hold a clean impression and fire evenly. The clay was mined, transported, and prepared. Then, for those tablets accidentally preserved by fire or intentionally baked for important archives, fuel was required: precious wood or charcoal burned to transform soft mud into permanent record. From the seed to the shekel to the stylus, every component of this early finance was rooted in resource extraction. It forces us to see these ancient merchants and scribes not as isolated figures in a human drama, but as actors within a broader ecological network. Their economy was a metabolism, consuming water, soil, timber, and ore, and converting them into the abstract but powerful substance of credit and social organization. This perspective shifts the story from one of pure human ingenuity to one of intricate adaptation. The system was a brilliant tool for managing scarcity and risk within a capricious environment, but it also amplified humanity's ability to reshape that environment. It organized labor to dig deeper mines, to channel water for larger harvests, to mobilize the cutting of forests for fuel and construction. Studying these ledgers, therefore, is not just an exercise in economic history. It is an archaeology of sustainability and strain. It shows us a civilization learning to bank not just silver, but also fertility and stability, while simultaneously building an economy whose very success increased its demand on the natural world. The clay tablet is a fossil of that relationship, a tiny, hardened piece of earth that once helped humans navigate their dependence on the vast, living earth from which it came. The divine was a silent partner in every transaction. For the Mesopotamians, the gods were not distant beings but active overseers of daily life, and this included the world of commerce and credit. Justice, fairness, and the upholding of oaths were divine concerns, presided over by deities like Shamash, the sun god. Shamash was not merely a celestial body. He was the ultimate judge, the one who saw every contract sealed and every promise made in the light of day. To swear an oath in his name or in the name of any major god was to invoke a cosmic witness. It transformed a business agreement into a sacred covenant. Breaking such a contract was not merely a breach of trust between two people, it was an offense against the divine order itself, inviting the wrath of the gods in the form of misfortune, illness, or ruin. This belief was a psychological enforcement mechanism of immense power, reaching into the conscience of a debtor in a way no human court ever could. The temple, as the literal house of the gods on earth, naturally became the epicenter of this fused spiritual and economic reality. It was more than a bank, it was a divinely sanctioned institution. When you took a loan of seed grain from the temple granary, you were not just borrowing from a wealthy landlord. You were entering into an agreement supervised by the patron deity of the city. Your repayment was not just settling a debt, it was fulfilling a religious duty, maintaining harmony with the gods who ensured the fertility of the land and the stability of the community. This framework meant that concepts like credit, debt, and default carried a moral weight we might struggle to grasp today. To default on a significant debt, particularly one owed to the temple, could be viewed as a form of sin, a disruption of the divinely appointed balance. It risked bringing divine displeasure not only upon yourself but potentially upon your household or even your wider community. This added a profound layer of social pressure that reinforced the entire system's stability. Your neighbors had a vested interest in you honoring your obligations, not just for economic reasons but for spiritual ones. They wanted the gods to look favorably upon their city, its harvests, and its fortunes. In this worldview, the meticulous ledger of the temple scribe was more than an account book. It was a spiritual record, a list of promises made under the watchful eyes of heaven. The system's resilience came from this dual foundation: the practical, calculable risk of ruined reputation and legal consequence, married to the profound, unquantifiable fear of cosmic imbalance. Finance was therefore a deeply ethical endeavor, a test of one's character in the sight of both man and the divine. The ledger's neat columns offer a powerful illusion of completeness. We can read the terms of a loan for 20 measures of barley, see the seals of the debtor and creditor, and note the due date after the harvest. What we cannot hear is the conversation that filled the room before the stylus ever touched the clay. The tablet is the final draft, the official record. It captures none of the tense negotiation, the persuasive appeals to family loyalty or past favors, the subtle social pressure a wealthy merchant might apply to a struggling farmer. We see the interest rate, but not the quiet desperation that may have led someone to accept such steep terms. The contract presents a clean, legal reality, scrubbed of the human friction that produced it. This silence extends to the resolution of conflict. A court record tablet might state the verdict: so much silver to be repaid, a field to be forfeited. It gives us the ending, but not the story. We miss the heated arguments before the elders, the presentation of witness testimonies, the strategic appeals to the city's gods or the king's sense of justice. The drama, the uncertainty, the very human theater of dispute is lost, leaving only a dry legal footnote. Most profoundly, the ledgers speak about bonded service in the detached language of accounting. A tablet may record that an individual entered the household of a creditor to work off a debt. It states the fact, but it tells us nothing of the personal experience. We cannot access the feeling of that transition, the worry for a family left behind, the nature of the daily labor, or the fragile hope for eventual release. The record is administrative, not autobiographical. It notes a change in status but guards the inner world of the person living through it. This is the essential boundary of our knowledge. The clay archives preserve the formal skeleton of the economy, the deals significant enough to write down, the disputes serious enough to bring before authorities. the outcomes deemed worthy of permanent record. They are, by their nature, biased toward success, or at least toward legal conclusion. They illuminate the world of the merchant, the temple, the literate elite. They are far less chatty about the vibrant, messy underworld of the informal economy. For every loan of silver sealed with a cylinder seal, there must have been 100 smaller exchanges, a day's labor traded for a basket of fish, a tool borrowed with a promise to return it after the sowing, a favor owed for help during an illness. This vast, silent network of microcredit, woven from personal trust and community memory, was the true economic bloodstream of daily life. It left no permanent trace. To read the tablets, then, is to engage in a careful act of reconstruction. We must hold their incredible detail in one hand, and in the other, hold an awareness of all they choose not to say. They are not a transparent window, but a brilliantly lit portal, casting some aspects into sharp relief while leaving others in deep shadow. Their greatest gift may be this very lesson in historical humility, reminding us that every record, no matter how ancient, is also a story of what was considered worth remembering and by whom. That silent witness of the divine soon found its voice in the written word of kings. The principles tested in the merchant's office and the temple archive did not remain informal custom. They were etched into stone, becoming the bedrock of law for entire civilizations. The most famous example towers over this history, the law code of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, carved around 1750 before the Common Era. This monumental stele is not merely a list of crimes and punishments. It is, in large part, a detailed commercial regulation manual. Numerous clauses are dedicated entirely to the financial system, formalizing the practices scribes had been recording on clay for centuries. Hammurabi's code sets maximum interest rates for loans of silver and grain, a direct attempt to curb the potential for exploitation. It outlines the rights and responsibilities of creditors and debtors with remarkable precision. One law states that if a debtor's field is flooded through no fault of his own, he does not have to repay his grain loan that year. Another details the consequences if a merchant misplaces goods entrusted to him for transport. This was not the invention of new rules, but the codification of established commercial wisdom. The king was taking the common law of the marketplace and giving it the permanent public authority of the state. By doing so, he was declaring that economic stability was a matter of royal justice, essential for the harmony of the realm. The tradition of written commercial law born in Mesopotamia became a river flowing through time. It influenced the legal systems of the Hittites and the Assyrians who followed. This river of legal thought eventually fed into the great streams of Greek and Roman law. The Roman concept of stipulatio, a formal verbal contract, and their detailed laws on partnership and debt carry clear echoes of those much earlier Near Eastern precedents. The core revolutionary idea was this: a promise, when properly witnessed and recorded, creates an obligation that society has a duty to enforce. This transforms trust from a personal feeling into a public institution. It means your word is not just your bond to one other person, but a bond recognized by the entire community and its governing powers. This is the clay tablet's most profound legal legacy. It established the written contract as a fundamental tool of civilization. Our modern world runs on this same principle. Every time you sign a loan agreement, lease an apartment, or accept the terms of service for a piece of software, you are participating in a ritual that began with a stylus pressing into wet clay 4,000 years ago. The specific concepts hammered out in that ancient context are equally familiar. The idea of collateral property pledged to secure a loan is detailed in Hammurabi's code. Our modern systems of liens and mortgages are direct descendants. The legal notion of liability, of being held responsible for a loss or a failure to fulfill an agreement, finds its early definitions in those laws governing caravan traders and warehouse managers. Even the difficult concept of bankruptcy, the structured handling of overwhelming debt, has roots in the ancient clean slate decrees and the formal processes for dealing with insolvent merchants. What we see is a continuous story of adaptation. Practical problems arose from the credit system: how to ensure fairness, how to resolve disputes, how to prevent systemic collapse. The solutions to those problems, first worked out in practice and then inscribed in law, became the scaffolding for ever more complex economies. The development of justice in this light is deeply pragmatic. It is shaped not in an abstract vacuum, but in the gritty reality of the marketplace, responding to the human need for predictable, enforceable rules that allow cooperation to flourish on a scale larger than kinship or tribe. The stone steel of Hammurabi and the humble clay ledger are two sides of the same great project, building a society where a promise made is a promise you can build a future upon. The final column on these ancient ledgers is not written in clay, but in the persistent patterns of human behavior. In our age of algorithmic trading and cryptocurrencies, the idea of studying 4,000-year-old mud tablets might feel like a purely academic exercise, a curiosity with no practical bearing on our digital world. The truth is precisely the opposite. This deep history reveals a stunning fact. Finance is not a modern invention of glass towers and flickering screens. It is a fundamental human technology for organizing society, as ancient and transformative as the invention of writing itself. It emerged not from a desire for abstract wealth, but from the pragmatic need to solve problems of survival, trust, and coordination across vast distances. By tracing its origins back to a merchant's sealed promise in a dusty Anatolian outpost, we perform a powerful act of demystification. We pull back the curtain on a world that often feels impenetrably complex, showing the human choices and social agreements at its core. This perspective changes how we interpret the economic dramas of our own time. The sudden collapse of a credit market, the crushing weight of personal debt, the fierce tension between financial innovation and the need for protective regulation. These are not uniquely modern plagues. They are recurring features of any complex society that has learned to trade in promises. The Assyrian merchant facing a caravan lost to bandits, the Babylonian king declaring a clean slate to prevent social revolt, the temple setting interest rates to balance risk and reward. They were navigating the same fundamental terrain we do today. The tools have evolved from stylus to blockchain, but the essential challenges remain. How do we price an uncertain future? How do we build systems that empower growth without guaranteeing their own collapse? How do we ensure that the machinery of credit serves the community rather than consuming it? Recognizing this long arc does not provide easy answers for today's policy debates, but it does offer something equally valuable: a deeper, more nuanced frame of reference. It grounds our often panic-stricken view of economic headlines in a much longer story of human adaptation and resilience. It reminds us that our current systems are not natural laws, but the latest iteration of a very old experiment. When we see a financial crisis, we can understand it not as an unprecedented catastrophe, but as a familiar, though painful, phase in a cycle that has repeated for millennia. This historical grounding fosters a kind of intellectual calm, an ability to see beyond the immediate shock to the enduring patterns and the human capacity for correction and reinvention. Ultimately, these clay tablets tell a story about our enduring attempt to build bridges of trust. Every loan, every bond, every digital token is still, at its heart, a promise that someone, somewhere, will honor an obligation in the future. That core human problem, extending trust beyond the horizon of our immediate sight, has not changed. By studying its earliest solutions, we gain a profound appreciation for the ingenuity of our ancestors and a clearer lens through which to view our own world. We see that the struggle is not to invent a perfect crisis-proof system, for that may be an impossible dream. The struggle, then as now, is to continually refine our tools for cooperation, to balance ambition with equity, and to remember that behind every transaction, whether etched in clay or encoded in light, lies the timeless human hope for a more secure and prosperous tomorrow. A world of high finance was already ancient when the first coins were minted. From the fire-hardened clay of Canish to the glowing pixels of a stock ticker, the unbroken thread of credit connects us across 4 millennia. These ledgers of the Bronze Age reveal a world not of primitive barter, but of astonishing financial sophistication, a system built on the most intangible foundation of all, trust. That trust was then recorded in a durable script and given teeth by the intertwined forces of community pressure and formal law. We have traced its path from the merchant's sealed promise to the temple's vast agricultural loans, from the bustling Karam to the king's clean slate decree. This system enabled the first long-distance globalization, moving tin and textiles across continents. It spurred innovation in accounting, law, and communication, demanding the organized thought that builds civilizations. Yet, with clear-eyed honesty, the same tablets also record the system's shadow, the creation of profound social inequalities when misfortune turned a financial obligation into a personal crisis. It is a stark and familiar mirror to our own times, reflecting the perennial challenge of harnessing economic power for collective good without letting it unravel the fabric of community itself. So the next time you tap a credit card, approve a digital loan, or glance at a stock market update, pause for a moment. Remember the ancient merchant in a dusty office, pressing his cylinder seal into a damp rectangle of clay, binding a future he would never see. That simple act, repeated countless times, started it all. It encoded a revolution in human cooperation that we are still living through today. If you found this journey into the deep roots of finance fascinating, smash that like button and subscribe for more explorations into history's hidden frameworks. Let us know in the comments which ancient innovation surprises you the most.